All right, folks, welcome back. Today we are on chapter 12. We're going to be talking about the executive branch or our presidency. So let's start with the minimum qualifications to be president of the United States. So our Constitution lays out the minimum qualifications for the office of president. And what those are is you have to be a minimum of 35 years old. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, at the age of 42, was our youngest U.S. president in history. And that number 35 has always kind of like made me wonder a little bit, like, why was 35 the magic number? Why wasn't it 45 or 55? Well, if we go back to the founding of our Constitution and we look at life expectancies were around the mid 40s back then. So requiring someone to be at least 35 years old meant that they had lived a majority of their life and probably had a lot of experience in politics and government and education and those sorts of things. If they'd made the requirement 45, 50, or higher, then it would have really narrowed the pool of eligible people to be president. So 35, my guess would be, was the magic number because that was probably about 10, 15 years below life expectancy at that point in time. What we see is there is a minimum age for our president, but there is no maximum age for our president. So in theory, we could have a president who is 100 years old. Our current president, Joe Biden, is the oldest president in history. When he took office, he was 78 years old. He's currently 81 years old, and is obviously the oldest one that we've ever had. You have to have also been a resident of the United States for 14 years. And this means that you do not have to have spent your entire life in the United States. You could have resided abroad, been in the military, done any of those things, as long as you've been a resident for a minimum of 14 years. And then you also have to be a native-born U.S. citizen. Native-born means that when you were born, you automatically acquired your U.S. citizenship, as opposed to naturalizing. Now, why our founding fathers thought it was important to have someone who is native born as opposed to allowing someone who's naturalized to be citizen deals a lot with loyalties. We want to make sure that whoever is leading our country is loyal to the United States and the United States only. We don't ever want to be put in a situation where we're worried about, well, hey, is this president also going to be loyal to his home country or, the country that he was born in? Those sorts of things. So by requiring them to be a native-born U.S. citizen, we take away that potential conflict of interest altogether. Now we see that there's no minimum educational requirements to be president of the United States. So if you check these three boxes, you're 35 years old, you're a resident for at least 14 years, and you're a native-born U.S. citizen, then you can run for president and be elected president. Why there are no minimum education or work experience requirements? It probably because they trusted that the electorate wouldn't elect someone who was incompetent or unqualified for the position itself. When we look at the requirements for the vice president, they're the exact same as the president, because if anything ever happens to the vice president steps in and takes on the role of president. So it makes sense that they would have the exact same requirements. Lecture review question number 1. What are the minimum qualifications to be president of the United States? Okay, so now that we know requirements, let's look at the presidential terms. So the president serves his terms. He has 2 4-year terms, and he can be removed by impeachment or under the 25th Amendment if he is disabled. So essentially, once a president is elected into office, he gets to serve his term of office unless he's disabled, unless he's been impeached by Congress, unless, God forbid, he passes away or he decides to leave office. Now, currently, we're limited to 2 4-year terms. But this didn't used to be the case. So the 22nd Amendment is the one that brought about this 2-term limit for us. Prior to that, presidents had always respected the idea that 2 terms should be the max, and at the end of their second term, they did not run for re-election. That, however, ended with Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So what happened was Roosevelt came in and was elected in 1932. And if you're a history buff, 1932, we were in the midst of the Great Depression. So he was elected and was reelected to bring us out of the Great Depression. So he did that with his New Deal policies. And right when it came up to the end of his second term, he looked around and looked at what was happening in the country and happening worldwide and decided that he needed to run for president again. So in September of 1939, a year before Roosevelt's term would have been up, Hitler invaded Poland, and 2 days later, France and Britain declared war on Germany. So we were in the midst of a world war. And he looked around and saw that there was no clear Democrat in his party that was popular enough or qualified to take over as president and lead us through this war. So Roosevelt decided to run again for a third term. He won that election. And then he ran again for a fourth term and won that election. So Roosevelt served 4 terms, or a total of 16 years, as president of the United States. Obviously, after that, Congress amended our Constitution with that 22nd Amendment to make sure now presidents can only serve a maximum of 2 terms. Now, a president in his last few months of his final term is what we call a lame duck president. Because that president cannot be reelected at the end of their 8 years, then there's no danger of them being able, Congress isn't as afraid of retaliation from the president. So the president can say to Congress, don't pass these policies, don't do this, don't do that. And Congress, a lot of times, will just kind of look at the president and be like, well, you're not going to be here in a couple of months, so you can say whatever you want, but we don't necessarily have to do what you want or listen to you as much. So he has less influence, he has less accountability with Congress and the country as well. So impeachment is one way that Congress is able to remove not only our president, but also our federal judiciary. So our federal judges, including the federal judges, the Supreme Court, our president, can all be removed by impeachment. Now, there are 3 grounds for impeachment. And the reason why we have impeachment applied to our president is we want to make it sure that the message is very clear that no one is above the law. The law, everyone in the country is accountable to the law, even our president, the leader of our country. So the 3 grounds are going to be treason, bribery, and other high crimes and misdemeanor. Now, treason is doing something that's against the interests of your country. So if you were to be giving secrets or weapons or supplies to a country that was then using that information to damage the U.S., that would be considered treason. Bribery, I'm assuming you all know what that is, but bribery is when you accept something from someone else in exchange for a favor or in exchange for favorable treatment. And then we have other high crimes and misdemeanors. And other high crimes and misdemeanors is a little more wishy-washy, because treason and bribery, we have clear definitions for those. Other high crimes and misdemeanors, there aren't clear definitions, but what we've seen is other high crimes and misdemeanors have been defined as violations of the public trust. If you do something that makes the public less confident in the office of the president, less confident in our government, that can be considered another high crime and misdemeanor. For example, if you do something that benefits the president but hurts the country, that's also going to be considered another high crime and misdemeanor. So here's how impeachment works. The impeachment starts in the House of Representatives. Remember that bicameral legislature we talked about last lecture? So they start in the House of Representatives, the bigger body, and the House of Representatives starts an investigation. And they'll look into whatever activity they think that the president or a federal judge has done that would constitute treason, bribery, or other high crimes or misdemeanors. So they do their investigation, they take witnesses, they call it, they have evidence, those sorts of things, and then they present all that evidence to the full House, and the House decides if they should bring articles of impeachment against the president. So if the House believes that there is sufficient evidence to prove that the president has committed treason, bribery, or other high crime and misdemeanor, they will vote to issue articles of impeachment. So the articles of impeachment are kind of like a charging document. So if you remember back when we talked about criminal trials and those sorts of things, and we talked about the requirement for a grand jury, the House is sort of the grand jury. We're giving them all the evidence and saying, this is why we think the president should be impeached. And the House is going to say, yes, there's enough there, and no, there's not enough there. And if they say yes, then they're going to bring articles of impeachment. Those articles of impeachment are then carried over to our Senate, and the Senate holds an actual trial. So the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is going to be in charge of that trial. And at the trial, the Senate is going to have the House managers from the impeachment inquiry in the House are going to come over, and they're going to present their case against the president. And then the Senate is going to have an opportunity, the president will have an opportunity to present witnesses and defend themselves. And then the Senate will finally have a vote to see whether or not that particular president has committed a crime, an impeachable offense. If he's found guilty and impeached, that means the president is then removed from office and is no longer president of the United States. Now, we've seen lots of impeachment activity happening in the United States over the past 7, 8 years. Donald Trump's first impeachment trial began in January, began in the U.S. Senate in 2020. That's not right, 2016. So what happened was once Donald Trump, so let's back up for a second. So Donald Trump is sort of an anomaly as a president for many, many reasons. But one of them was that he's one of the few presidents that has faced multiple impeachment trials. So what happened is the first impeachment trial that he had dealt with the Ukraine and what we call the quid pro quo. So what he had said was leading up to the his reelection campaign, he reached out to or he had his representatives reach out to the Ukraine and basically tell them that, I need you to announce that you're launching an investigation into Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, and Joe Biden. Now, the reason he wanted Ukraine to do this was he wanted to make Joe Biden look bad, make him look like he was corrupt. And so he said, if this foreign government announces that they're investigating him, it's going to make him look bad. And then I can use that in my campaign to try and show that I'm a better person for president than Joe Biden would be. President of Ukraine, and what he said to him essentially was, if you start this investigation, then I will make sure that you get the weapons, that you'll get the supplies that you need that we've already authorized to give to you. I'll make sure you get them. But if you don't do that, then you may not get them. So that was called quid pro quo, because it was, if you do something for me, then I'm going to do something for you. So the House of Representatives brought impeachment charges against Donald Trump based upon this quid pro quo as an other high crime and misdemeanor. Basically, he was using the office of the president in order to gain a favor from another president from another country to help him in his reelection efforts. So it went to the House of Representatives, and the House of Representatives at that time was controlled by the Democrats. And this was very, very partisan. It was very much Democrats were for the impeachment. Republicans were very strongly against the impeachment. So the Democrats controlled the House of Representatives, so they were able to get those impeachment charges brought. And then it went over to the Senate where the trial was held. Now, in the Senate was controlled by the Republicans. So the Republicans at the conclusion voted not to impeach Donald Trump, and he was able to keep his job. Now, why all this went down? Was it partisan? Was it because the Democrats were trying to make Donald Trump look bad to hurt his reelection campaign? Were the Republicans voting against impeachment because they wanted to make sure that Donald Trump maintained his role as president to try and bolster his chances of being reelected? Probably. Were there bad acts involved? Were there Republicans who legitimately thought that the president hadn't committed a high crime or misdemeanor? Probably also as well. But what we saw were the impeachment attempts against Donald Trump were based on there was merit to the cases themselves, but the mere fact that they were brought and prosecuted probably had more to do with partisan politics than anything else. We also saw that he was charged in another impeachment inquiry in January 13th of 2021. Now, remember, Donald Trump lost the 2020 election. And then on January 6th of 2021, Congress certified the election, making Joe Biden the next president. Now, Joe Biden wasn't sworn in for another couple of weeks, but what we saw in the interim was on January 6th of 2021, we had that Capitol insurrection, which arguably Donald Trump encouraged and promoted. And based upon that, we had, the individuals, the January 6th defendants who came in and stormed the Capitol, vandalized the building, caused lots and lots of damage. So the argument that the Democrats in the House of Representatives brought was that basically he was obstructing justice. The high crime and misdemeanor that he was committing was he was trying to stop the proceedings happening in Congress, the lawful certification of the election. And so by encouraging that, by encouraging the insurrection, he was obstructing justice, obstructing Congress. Now, why would they bring this impeachment charge against Donald Trump? He had already lost the election. He was going to be out of office in a couple of weeks. So there was no real, it wasn't like this impeachment trial was going to keep him from, finishing out his term because it was already over. The Democrats bought these impeachment charges against Donald Trump in the House of Representatives because they wanted to try and prevent Donald Trump from running for president again. They knew that if they could impeach him from office, then he would be disqualified from ever running for office again. So they brought these impeachment charges in the House of Representatives, went through and passed in the House of Representatives, and the Democrats actually thought they had a decent chance of getting these impeachment charges, the conviction in the Senate, because the Senate, just like the House of Representatives, was impacted by the January 6th insurrection. And there were members of the Republican Party after the insurrection that came out publicly and talked about how terrible it was and denounced the insurrection. So the Democrats thought they might have enough Republicans that would be willing to impeach Donald Trump because his actions put them in danger as well. What we saw, however, was that was not the case. When the trial went to the Senate and the Senate had an opportunity to impeach Donald Trump, they voted against the impeachment. So Donald Trump has had articles of impeachment brought against him multiple times, but he has never been actually impeached in the United States, which is why he's allowed to run for re-election for president. All right. So there's been other talks about impeachment with Joe Biden and the classified documents. So what happened here is Joe Biden and Donald Trump have both been found with classified documents that were top secret that they were not supposed to take with them. So when you're a president or vice president, all the documents you receive in the operation of your duties, the briefing reports, all the information, that is property of the U.S. government. And the National Archives is charged with keeping all of those documents and cataloging them and storing them for historic value. So you're not allowed to take any of these top secret documents with you when you leave office. So the issue started really with Donald Trump, where the National Archives was missing documents. They knew there were documents that were in existence that they could not find. So the National Archives reached out to Donald Trump a couple of times and said, hey, we're looking for these documents. Do you have them? And he said, no, I don't have them. Now, the National Archives didn't believe him and the government didn't believe him because they, had reason to believe, they had heard that he'd been showing off documents at Mar-a-Lago, that he's, been showing them around. So they just didn't believe him. So they were able to obtain a search warrant and they searched Donald Trump's residence and his business offices at Mar-a-Lago. From that search, they were able to recover 325 documents that Donald Trump was not supposed to have that belonged to the federal government. Among those 325 documents, 60 of them were marked as top secret. So from that FBI raid, then, Donald Trump was then put under investigation for obstruction of justice. In the United States Code, which is the federal law, United States Code 2071 says whoever willfully and unlawfully conceals, removes, mutilates, obliterates, or destroys or attempts to do so with the intent to take and carry away any record, proceeding, map, book, paper, etc. Of the United States shall be fined under this title or imprisoned. So basically what the United States Code says is it's illegal to take documents, whether you do it on purpose or not on purpose, from the government. So Donald Trump has been charged now with taking these documents without permission and maintaining them. But then Joe Biden discovered documents one day when he was at his home in Delaware in his office, he discovered top secret documents. So the reason why Joe Biden was treated differently than Donald Trump was he discovered the documents, he turned them over to his attorneys, and then he had his attorneys contact the government and say, hey, we have found these top secret documents. We want to make sure that you know that we have them and we want to return them to you. And so it is said that he fully cooperated with this investigation. He brought the documents forth on his own. He was the one that said, like, this is, here you go. He cooperated. He allowed them to search his residence. Some of those were obviously top secret documents. But because it was handled differently, the argument is that, and the special prosecutor that was assigned to Joe Biden's classified documents in February of 2024 decided not to bring charges against him. And one of the reasons was how it was handled, because he was very transparent about it and forthcoming and cooperated fully, as opposed to Donald Trump. Now, there has been some argument, about whether or not Joe Biden should have been prosecuted when they went and Subsequent to Joe Biden finding these documents, Mike Pence, former Vice President Mike Pence, also found classified documents at his home and his residence. So the idea that, Joe Biden was treated special because he was a Democrat or because he was a president doesn't necessarily hold true, because we see that Mike Pence, who was vice president as well, found classified documents and he was not prosecuted. Only Donald Trump has been prosecuted, and Donald Trump did not cooperate with the investigation and withheld information from the National Archives. Okay, so our lecture review question number 2, what are the 3 grounds for impeachment? All right, so let's take a look at our vice president. So we know that the requirements of our vice president are identical to those of the president, because if something happens to the president, the vice president takes over as president. Now, the constitutional duties, what the Constitution says is that the vice president, number 1, presides over the Senate. So she's the one in the Senate that's, remember, going to cast that tie-breaking vote if they come to a 50-50 vote. She's also, the figurehead of the Senate, although she doesn't really do a lot there. And then she takes over the office of the president if that office becomes vacant. What we've seen is originally the office of the president wasn't meant to hold a lot of power. It was sort of a placeholder. But we've seen with different vice presidents coming in and being more active or less active, we've seen the power of the vice president expanded. So we've seen our vice presidents represent the office of the president in overseas visits. So if there is a special event, say a wedding or a funeral or something that the president is unable to attend, a lot of times they will send the vice presidents in their place. The vice president has the ability to go to Congress and lobby Congress to try and ensure that the party platform is enacted or that the president's policies are supported. You see a lot of the vice president during our midterm elections, those congressional elections that are the House representative elections that happen every 2 years. She's out there campaigning for members of their party. And she's also one of the president's key advisors. So they have the president's ear, and they're able to help them make decisions and give their opinions when things are happening within the presidency itself. All right, so if we look at the history of our presidency, let me back up for 1 second. Actually, yeah, we'll stay here. So history of our presidency, 46 men have been president of the United States throughout the time in our country. Now, there should be a little asterisk there, because for a very, very brief moment, Kamala Harris was acting president of the United States. So there came a point in time where Joe Biden needed to have some sort of elective surgery done, and he needed to go under anesthesia. So while he went under anesthesia, he temporarily transferred powers to Kamala Harris, so that if there was some sort of emergency happening, she would be able to respond to it on behalf of our country. So 46 men have been president of the United States, with a little asterisk where we've had Kamala Harris for a few hours on a Friday afternoon, was technically president of the United States as well. So we saw that our founding fathers, when they envisioned the executive branch and they envisioned the role of the presidency, they didn't really want to give that branch or the president a ton of power. They wanted the president to just be more of a figurehead for the country, but not actively involved in legislation and those sorts of things. However, we've seen that as presidents have come into office, they have done things to expand their power to grab more power for themselves. We've seen them, do acts of aggression, undeclared acts of war, where they will send our soldiers out, even though they're supposed to have approval of Congress for a war. We've seen that the presidents have created their own cabinets to help them do their jobs. The Monroe Doctrine, where, President Monroe said to the European countries, if you interfere with our business, that's going to be considered an act of aggression. We've seen the presidents do lots and lots of things to get more power for themselves. All right, so what does our president do? Our president wears several hats or serves several roles for our country: chief of state, chief executive, chief diplomat, commander-in-chief, chief legislator, and party leader. So we're going to take a quick look at each of those roles. So as the chief of state, it's that a position that our founding fathers envisioned for the president. They're the symbolic chief as well as the head of our government. So as chief of state, we're going to see our president doing lots of sort of ceremonial things. When a foreign dignitary comes, he will greet that foreign dignitary. He'll host them at a dinner at the White House. There might be the World Series and the president shows up and throws out the first pitch for the World Series. Those sorts of things are being done as his role as chief of state. Now, chief executive, this role is actually given to our president in Article 2 of our Constitution. So in theory, our president is in total control of the bureaucracy. And we're going to talk about the bureaucracy. I think it's the last chapter or the last module that we have. We're going to talk about bureaucracy, but the bureaucracy is basically the employees of the executive branch of the government that carry out the laws. When Congress passes those laws and then it comes to the president and the president signs it, it then gets given to the bureaucracy, and they're the ones that actually do the work of the executive branch. So the bureaucracy is the workers in our federal government. It is the world's largest administrative organization. In 2018, they had over 2 million, or they had almost 2 million civilians working for the bureaucracy. There's lots and lots of criticism about the bureaucracy because it's so big and it expanded the size of the government. But basically, as chief executive, the president is in charge of the bureaucracy. The president also serves as our chief diplomat. So under the Constitution, the president has been given the power to establish relations with foreign governments, to appoint U.S. ambassadors and to sign treaties that take effect once the Senate has confirmed it. So these powers are given to our president. So we see that the president is involved with foreign countries. He represents the United States in these negotiations with foreign countries. Now, as commander-in-chief, the president is in charge of our armed forces. So the idea here is our founding fathers did not want someone from the military in charge of all of the armed forces. They wanted a civilian in charge of the armed forces because they wanted to make sure that the decisions were being made weren't necessarily always coming from the perspective of the military. They wanted to have a civilian perspective in charge. In practice, the ability to run the armed forces is given to the Secretary of Defense, and they're the ones that make the decisions in regard to that. But as the commander-in-chief, our president is in charge of all of our military. Now, as the commander-in-chief, he has used that power to, send troops over to, the Constitution gives the Congress the power to declare war, but the president has used his ability as the commander-in-chief to actually send troops out to engage in conflicts. We've seen that the Congress has tried to pull back his power as commander-in-chief. 1973, the War Powers Act limited the president's ability to send troops without a declaration of war. The president also serves as our chief legislator, and as our chief legislator, he is given the ability to recommend measures to Congress. We can go to Congress and say, hey, these are the bills I want you to pass. This is what I think you should focus on this year. He also has the ability to veto. So if legislation comes out of Congress, we talked about this last lecture, and the president doesn't like it, he can veto that bill so that it doesn't become a law. And then finally, the president serves as our party leader. So he is the head of his political party. So right now, Joe Biden is the party leader for the Democratic Party. As the head of the party leader, he gets to choose who he wants to run as vice president with him. He gets to distribute offices. His job is to fulfill the party platform. And his job is also to raise money to campaign and fundraise for the Democratic Party, not just for his own reelection, but for the Democratic Party and for other members of his party that are up for election or reelection. So we take a quick look at the federal bureaucracy. We're not going to spend a ton of time because, like I said, we're going to cover this in the final chapter. But the federal bureaucracy are the ones that carry out most of the work of the government. So most of the enforcement, the enactment of those laws from Congress, it's the bureaucrats and the federal bureaucracy that are doing that. When we look at, this is the organizational chart of the United States. This should be very familiar to you. On the side over here, we have Congress, legislative branch. Over here, we have the judicial branch or the courts. We're going to talk about that in the next lecture. And over here, we have the executive branch. We have the president, the vice president, the executive office of the president. And then he's got all these departments below him. And then he's got these government agencies and corporations. So these are our bureaucrats. These are the ones that are doing the work of our government. So we look at the executive office, the cabinet departments, the executive agencies, and then the regulatory commissions. those are all part of our bureaucracy, and our president is in charge of all of these different departments. Okay, so closest to the president is the executive office of the president. So this office was established in 1939 to help the president manage the bureaucracy. So as the size of bureaucracy grew, they realized that the president wasn't going to be able to just manage it by himself, needed to bring in a team to help him manage it. So it's grown into a major bureaucracy itself. So the executive office of the president employs nearly 4,000 people and over a dozen agencies, but they are there to help him run the other bureaucracies that are below them. The three most important offices within the executive office of the president are the Office of the White House, the National Security Council, and the Office of Management and Budget. Now, the Office of the White House, or the White House office, is seen as being sort of controversial because they are the gatekeepers. They are the ones that restrict access to the president. So if a member of Congress wants to discuss something with the president, they have to go through the White House office first to be able to schedule that or to get information to the president. So since they are the ones that control the information that comes to the president, sometimes they're not very popular within our government. Now, the National Security Council was established in 1947, and its job is to coordinate American military and foreign policies for the president. It was established in response to the Cold War, when it became obvious that the president was going to need some help managing how we responded to the USSR. And finally, the Office of Management and Budget, what we know as the OMB, was created in 1970 by President Nixon to help him balance the budget. We know from our lecture last week that the president has to propose a budget to Congress in January of every year. How he gets that budget is the OMB does all the busy work behind the scenes for him. They gather the information, they create reports, and then they present that to the president with these are our suggestions for the upcoming budget. Okay. Now, under the executive office of the president, we have our cabinet departments. And the cabinet departments were created by Congress. And these are the major agencies of the federal government. Initially, Congress gave us three cabinet departments. We had the Department of State, we had the Department of War, and we had the Department of Treasury. Where we stand now, we have 15 different cabinets. And basically, there's a cabinet to address every single problem or issue we might have here in the United States. Now, the heads of these departments, or the cabinets, I'm sorry, we call them our secretaries. So when you hear someone referred to as the Secretary of Commerce or the Secretary of Education, know that that is the person in charge of that particular cabinet department. Now, the cabinets as a body have no official power. It's up to the president to decide, am I going to use this cabinet? How much authority am I going to give to this cabinet? Or am I going to ignore them altogether? So when we see the work being done by these cabinets, basically the work they're doing is work that supports whatever interest they were assigned to. So, Department of Labor is going to deal with employment, Department of Agriculture is going to deal with the farms and those sorts of things. The most recent department that we had added, cabinet department that was added was the Department of, where is it? Is it even on there? It is not on there. Department of Homeland, so the Department of Homeland Security is not listed there. Sorry, guys. But that is the most recent department that was added, and that was added to deal with things like immigration, border safety, and so forth. Now, what we see is the Constitution requires our cabinet heads to be confirmed by the Senate. So under the Constitution, the president gets to appoint who's going to run these cabinets, who his secretaries are going to be, and the heads of his bureaucracies. But he doesn't, this Constitution is silent on removing those. So the president appoints someone, Congress has to confirm that person, say, yes, we think they're the appropriate person for the job. And then they serve in that position once they're approved by Congress. But the Constitution is silent on firing someone within the federal bureaucracy. So it has been said that basically the heads of the departments in the bureaucracy, they serve at the pleasure of the president. So the president can remove someone from the heads of these departments at any time for pretty much any reason, so long they have to follow proper procedures, but the president can remove someone. So who you have pictured here, his name is Andrew Saul. He was appointed by the Trump administration to be the Social Security Commissioner. He was wildly unpopular within the government. When the COVID-19 hit and we had the government shutdowns, he resisted shutting down the Social Security offices. Once the pandemic was a little more under control and we had more information about it, he pushed really hard to have his employees in the Social Security Department come back to the office and try to end the work from home, the ability of them to work from home. So he was not very popular. So Joe Biden, when he became president in 2021, removed Mr. Saul from office in July of 2021, and replaced him with one of his own picks. All right. So now our president has the ability to check our judiciary. So we know we're going to talk about judiciary next lecture, but we've got these three different branches. And so the president has the ability to basically tell the judicial branch, our federal judiciary, that they don't like what they're doing and try and influence them into behaving differently. The first way they do this is by the nomination of our Supreme Court justices and our federal justices. So just like our executive, the bureaucracy officer, or heads, the president nominates them. They go to the Senate, and the Senate Judiciary Committee confirms these justices, and then they get their jobs. So the president has the ability to hand pick who he wants to be on the federal judiciary when there is a vacancy. And by picking who is going to take that position, he can ensure that that particular justice is going to make decisions that align with his party's values, that will probably support the party platform. And so by nominating justices, he's able to control the types of decisions that are coming out of our federal judiciary. Another big check that the president has on our judiciary is the ability to enforce or not enforce Supreme Court decisions. So the Supreme Court we're going to hear about doesn't have any sort of military or police force of its own. It issues decisions, and then it relies on Congress and the executive branch to enforce those decisions. So if the Supreme Court comes down with a decision that the president does not in favor of or does not like, the president can refuse to enforce that Supreme Court decision. And there's very little that the Supreme Court can do to force the president to enforce their decision. So we'll see a lot of times the Supreme Court, if they know that the decision they're about to put out is going to be contrary to what the president will enforce, they might hold off on issuing that decision until there's a new president in place or until public opinion supports them more. Let's review question number 3. How can the president check the judiciary? The two ways we just talked about. And then finally, the president has the ability to check our Congress as well. So Congress gets to write those laws. The president doesn't get to create laws. And then the president has the ability to veto those laws. So if there's legislation that comes out of Congress that the president is opposed to, he can veto that legislation and prevent it from becoming a bill or becoming a law. The president also has the ability to enforce and administer the federal laws. So those laws, again, that are being passed by Congress are the federal laws. It gets handed off to the executive branch, and the executive branch then gets to actually enforce those laws. So what that looks like is when those laws are given to the president might direct his executive agencies, like, you're going to enforce that law, but you're going to enforce it this way, maybe not always keeping true to what the intent of Congress was. Now, the president also has the ability to issue executive orders. So executive orders are directives issued by the president to the federal agencies, telling them how to do their jobs. So instead of relying on Congress to come out and say, hey, we're going to pass this law and do this or do that, the president can just basically say to the bureaucracy, this is how you're going to behave. This is what you're going to do. We've seen as of June of 2024, President Biden had issued 139 executive orders during his term as presidency. The president who has issued the most executive orders was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He had those New Deal policies, but he also was in office for a total of 16 years. So it makes sense that he would have had more executive orders. We see that the first state of emergency was declared by President Harry Truman in 1950 during the Korean War. To try and make sure that we had enough troops to protect us during the Korean War. Since 1976, we've seen, I'm sorry, back up for a second. So we've seen these executive orders being issued. Our Dreamers, our DACA, our Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, that program that allowed young children that were brought here to the United States, who then went through the U.S. school system to get a temporary status in the United States. That was an executive order issued by President Obama. The reason he issued that executive order is Congress had for years and years and years had an opportunity to pass a law that would help, these young students or these children that were brought over, and Congress just never acted on it. So Obama basically got tired of waiting for Congress to do something and then issued the executive order telling the Department of Homeland Security that they were going to implement this DACA program. Presidents also have the ability to declare a state of emergency if there's something happening in the country that requires immediate action where there isn't time to wait for Congress to go through and deliberate and go to House committees and everything else and then decide on. The president can act quickly through a state of emergency. Now, since 1976, we've seen over 80 state of emergencies issued in the United States, and they cover everything from land use to the military to public health. The only way you can stop a state of emergency is if both houses of Congress vote to veto it, and then it can go to the courts, and the courts can decide whether or not to allow it to remain. One of the more recent state of emergencies was the COVID-19 declaration, where Donald Trump declared a state of emergency in response to this global pandemic. And what that state of emergency did, the way it was beneficial, was it changed how the government could react to the COVID-19 pandemic. So FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Association, the one that comes in when there's an emergency and gives aid, the way it's written is FEMA can only come in and give aid if the governor of a state requests their assistance. So California's Governor Newsom says, hey, we need help because of the COVID-19 pandemic or because of the wildfires, then FEMA can come in and give us aid. But if we have a governor that does not request aid, then we never get that federal aid from FEMA. So the COVID-19 state of emergency removed that requirement and allowed local governments to request aid from FEMA and bypass their governors. It allowed our Secretary of Health and Human Services to declare a public health emergency, which gave them the ability to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic much faster. They didn't have to go through all the same administrative procedures. By declaring that public health emergency, they were able to establish our COVID-19 task force. And they also were able to require that private companies here in the United States prioritize the needs of the United States over the needs of other countries. So companies and factories that were producing PPD, masks and, gloves and all those other sorts of things had to fill the U.S. orders first before they filled their foreign orders. So they wanted to make sure here in the U.S. we were able to get our PPD that we needed to make sure that we were able to stay safe. We've seen, the national emergency was issued in 2001 in response to the September 11th terrorist attacks, which then allowed our military to go out and actively seek out Osama bin Laden, and it also gave them the ability to react and strengthen the safety of our borders. All right, so let's review question number 4. How can the president check Congress? We talked about 4 ways. Tell me what those 4 ways